some of the aesthetic appeal of ecology is discovering connections between things that weren't thought to be connected. And so, because there's a lot of bias in our science against really confronting complexity, we have to step back and look at it explicitly. My claim is that the immediate direct source of major errors in contemporary science and applications comes from posing a problem too narrowly, treating things as static, which are really varying. And so we have examples like the epidemiological transition, which caught public health by surprise because it said that infectious diseases had been eliminated. The Green Revolution, which thought that the solution to hunger was to breed a higher yielding grass. Sociobiology, which attempted to explain the present social relations in terms of an evolution from the Pleistocene. And so what they did was say, these are the way things are now. That's because these are the way things were 100,000 years ago, and we evolved for 100,000 years ago, and that's continued to now. So that's the main argument of sociobiology, along with that other kinds of genetic determination, particularly in relation to justifying oppression. And so racism, sexism, homophobia have all attempted to find simple, linear, genetic explanations for the phenomena that we don't like, but try to adapt to, try to say that they're inevitable. Now, reductionism has been the dominant philosophy of Western science since it arose in the 17th century in Europe. Reductionism is the belief that if you reduce a problem to its smallest parts, you can vary things one at a time, and when you've understood the smallest parts, you then understand the whole system. All you have to do then is glue it together. And this more or less works when you're dealing with circuit diagrams, with artifacts, with radios, because the behavior of the part in the laboratory in isolation is pretty much like the way it will behave when you put it into the whole, because the parts are manufactured separately. Therefore, they have an identity prior to the whole. In the systems that we work with in ecology and in society, the parts don't have existence independent of the whole. They arise with the whole. It's not always obvious what an appropriate part is to the system. How do you divide something up to study? Depends on what you're trying to study. Now, reductionism is different from reduction. Reduction as a research tactic is simply the idea that it's good to know what something is made of and how the pieces interact. Reductionism is the belief that once you've done that, you understand everything you need to know. And so this has resulted in the idea that biology is molecular biology. The term modern biology usually refers to genetics and biochemistry, and therefore doesn't deal with modern paleontology, modern biogeography, modern functional anatomy, and so forth. There was a time when it was believed that anatomy was a dead subject, that we've learned all we could about organism by dissection. And therefore, generally in the medical schools, the people who taught anatomy were people who really worked in other fields. And they were doing the anatomy because it was a job. But there's been a revival of anatomy, with functional anatomy, with understanding the mechanics of movement, the microanatomy, neurobiology and network anatomy, and so on. Now, the reason for reductionism being the dominant approach to science is that science arose along with modern capitalism. And capitalism also has a reductionist view of the world. It sees the society as separate individuals, each pursuing their own interests, interacting at their boundaries, for instance in the marketplace, and after the interaction, bouncing off and going their own way without having been changed by that interaction. This very atomistic approach informs the politics of capitalism, the economics, social programs, and so forth. So because of this, because it seems self-evident that the world is made up of separate business enterprises or separate individuals trying to maximize their economic benefit, that seemed to be a model for the whole world. And so nature was seen also as atoms colliding in the void, having nothing to do with each other except in their collisions, not being influenced by the collision, and being really independent of the context that they're in. Nevertheless, there was also a tradition going way back of the criticism of reductionism. This is true in the non-Western societies that tended to have a more holistic view. They saw the great chain of being in Europe, talked about a world in which everything is located in a place. The earth was seen as a living thing, producing minerals almost as if it were a birthing process, and producing organisms. In Caroline Merchant's book, The Death of Nature, she talks about the intellectual changes that took place with the development of modern capitalism and science, eliminating the connectedness of the world. The connectedness was much more a part of the thinking in the non-Western sciences. Things were viewed much more in a holistic and connected way. It was sometimes placed in the context of spiritual metaphors. Buddhism, for instance, emphasizes the connection among things, saying that all is one. Now, of course, we know that all is not one if you take it too literally. Things are obviously different. But the claim all is one meant that they're very intimately connected, that the existence has meaning by virtue of its connections to other things. Buddhism also stressed the idea of change, that everything is transient. And whereas modern psychology talks about discovering your true self, Buddhism says that there is no such thing, that the self is constantly evolving through your activities, that it's a creation of activity and interconnection rather than an atom of consciousness. So Buddhism and Marxism shared this view of the interconnectedness of the world and of constant change. There were other movements, other authors. Smuts in South Africa talked about the whole greater than the sum of its parts. Bergson talked about emergence. And so for a long time there was an uneasiness with the reductionism.